How did four spies shape the founding of the CIA? Scott Anderson will be here to talk about his new book, The Quiet Americans. Who is the man who ran Washington for decades? Peter Baker and Susan Glasser join us to talk about James A. Baker III, the subject of their new biography. Alexander Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's September 25th. I'm Pamela Paul. Scott Anderson joins us now from the Catskills. He is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and the author of many books. His latest is called The Quiet Americans, Four CIA Spies at the Dawn of the Cold War, a Tragedy in Three Acts. Scott, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Pamela. Nice to be here.
So you were last on the podcast to talk about your previous book, Lawrence in Arabia, which came out in 2013, which of course feels like now centuries ago. Which makes it clear, I think, to our listeners, our longtime listeners, that this is not your first book involving spies. I'm curious, what's the draw for you?
I think spies are just inherently fascinating, and not just to me, but to an awful lot of people. And I've thought about what that is, and I think it's the allure of having a secret life. I think that for an awful lot of people, this idea that you have a whole separate identity is really fascinating to people. What I was drawn to in both in Lawrence and in The Quiet Americans, the four CIA officers I follow, is that in both cases, this was at a time when individuals out in the field had a tremendous freedom of action. So it wasn't people sitting behind desks following policy, that they were actually out in the field kind of doing crazy stuff.
You also have a personal connection to this story, right? In terms of what your father did for a living. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. My father was agricultural advisor for the Agency for International Development, which was a branch of the State Department. I grew up in East Asia, in Korea and Taiwan and Indonesia. And this was in the 1950s and 1960s when I came along. American government workers abroad, often in those sorts of countries, often wore two hats. I mean, whatever their official job was, my father's job was an agriculture advisor. But it was also part of this great anti-communist crusade that was happening around the world. So the kind of upfront hearts and minds, soft power aspect of my father's work was working on agrarian reform in a lot of these countries. A lot of these countries where the land had been controlled by, for centuries by oligarchies. But the more hard power and kind of darker side of what my father was doing was setting up essentially rural vigilante squads, home guard militias to watch over the local populace and to make sure that they weren't being swayed by the communists. And certainly in countries like Taiwan or South Korea, if you were exposed or accused of being a leftist, your life was not going to go well.
I'm now getting a sense of why one of the four characters in your previous book was an agronomist, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's an interesting thing because AID, the Agency for International Development, was often used by the CIA as a cover because agronomists are out in the field. They're not sitting behind desks in the Capitol. They're often out, among the local population, and probably have a better sense of what's happening outside. One thing I'll say, I've noticed over time in different countries I've been, almost invariably the expatriate community that knows best of what's happening in a country tend to be the people who are out in the field, and often in the Middle East, it's the oil guys. It's they have a sense much more than people sitting around in the Capitol.
Let's start with Frank Wisner, the first person you mentioned. And this is not the first book to be written, at least in part, about Wisner. Who was he and what made him so central to the story?
Wisner's an amazing character. He was a corporate lawyer who was working at a Wall Street firm even before World War II broke out, and he quit his law firm to join the Navy. He ended up being an operative for the Office of Strategic Services, which is the wartime intelligence agency of the Army.
This is the OSS and kind of the precursor to the CIA?
That's right. And he ends up being kind of the first American to witness the Soviet takeover of a country in Eastern Europe. And this was in Romania in the summer of 1944. So a full year before the war ended. And Wisner was on the ground as an OSS operative, and just watched the strong arm tactics that really in a matter of weeks led the Soviets to take control of the country. He was sending cables back to Washington, telling them what our Soviet allies were doing. He then sees he has the same experience in Eastern Germany at the end of the war, and watching the way the Soviets are taking over. He goes back to his law firm for a couple of years, but completely unhappy. And then when the CIA starts up in 1947, they have this idea that they want to start a covert operations branch of the CIA called the Office of Policy Coordination. And Frank Wisner is chosen to head that. The name was deliberately chosen to be really boring. And
They always are, right?
that's right. And in fact, the name itself, the Office of Policy Coordination, was so top secret that even you couldn't even say the name out loud for 25 years. So in that role, Wisner, he created what he called the Mighty Wurlitzer, which was this vast covert operations umbrella of that was operated throughout the world, and everything from hard power aspects of it, like dropping partisans behind the Iron Curtain, to everything to kind of cultural stuff. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, that was all came out of the Office of Policy Coordination.
Let's talk about Michael Burke, who's I think probably a less well-known name than Wisner to most readers. Who was he? I think he was described in your book as a kind of James Bond-like character.
Yeah, I describe Burke as James Bond before James Bond existed. He was really a remarkable figure. He was extremely handsome, extraordinarily charming. People describe him as the most charming man they'd ever met. His whole life was marked by these incredible highs and lows. He was a commando for the OSS during World War II, dropped behind Nazi lines. Right after the war, he went out to Hollywood for a couple of years. He was a script consultant, and he then ended up he wanted to be a writer, so he moved to New York to become a writer, and consequently fell into poverty,
As one does.
as one does. Yeah. And in 1949, he was recruited by the Office of Policy Coordination to head up this scheme to overthrow the government of Albania. Albania in southeastern Europe was controlled by a communist despot, and the CIA had decided that if they could break away any of the countries in Eastern Europe, the most likely would be Albania. So Burke, because he's penniless, he agrees to it. He and his wife moved to Rome, which is kind of the center of the Albanian emigre community. And so he's meeting with these Albanian commandos at night and planning these operations into Albania. But during the day, he's hanging out. What he came up with as his cover story was that he was a film producer. So during the day, he's hanging out with all these, it's kind of the golden age of Italian cinema. So he's hanging out with all these directors and Italian film stars. At one point, he starts to worry that, I keep telling everybody I'm a film producer, but I'm not actually producing anything. At a certain point, people are going to become suspicious. But what he discovered was that, just like Hollywood, the Italian film people were so self-absorbed. all they wanted to do was talk about themselves. They never asked him a question. So he could have stayed undercover for like indefinitely.
This is like Argo before Argo.
That's right. Yes.
Peter Sichel, which you probably can tell from the pronunciation of the name, is the only one of the four who is not born American, right? He's a German emigre. Who was he, and how does he fit into the larger narrative here?
Peter Sichel was really, every biographer dreams of finding a chest of letters in an attic somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and Peter's kind of that for me. He's still alive. He's actually turning 98 next week. He is the last of this generation of early CIA officers to still be around. Sharp as a tack, and best of all, he agreed to a series of interviews with me. Peter was from a German Jewish family. They escaped Nazi Germany. He got to the States as a teenager just before the war. He also ends up joining the OSS. And because he's a fluent German speaker, obviously, he's involved. One of the things he does is he trains German POWs to sneak back inside Nazi-held territory in Europe to spy. So he runs this whole kind of cross front lines scheme late in the war. At the end of the war, he is made the head of this covert operations unit in Berlin, precursor to the CIA. this is the amazing thing with Peter, and it tells you how clueless the Americans were of this coming conflict with the Soviet Union. Berlin, of course, being at that time was the ground zero of the coming Cold War. And there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Soviet intelligence agents running around Berlin in 1945, 46. Peter was the head of a 9-man unit, and he had just turned 24. So they really had no idea of what they were in for. Not to take anything away from Peter, he's a brilliant man, but the idea that that was headed up by a 24-year-old is pretty astonishing.
What was it like interviewing him?
He's a wonderful man. He has astonishing recall of events over time, and even, but once a spy, always a spy. I think there are certain moments in our conversations where we just reach a point where he'd say, I probably really shouldn't talk about that. And
Still.
yeah, and I'd say, come on, Peter, that happened 60 years ago. But he still kind of lived by the code. But a really remarkable man. Peter reached a point where he was just sort of sickened out of the agency. He had, because of his role in Berlin, he was in Berlin until the 1952, 53. He had watched just this disastrous string of these commando operations behind the Iron Curtain. Hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers went over, never to be seen again, to be picked up, in most cases, almost the moment they hit the ground. They were picked up by the KGB or the local secret police. Just an unbroken string of disasters. In 1960, he was out as the CIA station chief in Hong Kong. And the kind of new number 2 man in the CIA had a meeting of station chiefs in the Philippines to announce this new initiative the agency was going to do of airdropping Chinese anti-communist partisans into Mao's China. And this was going to be $100 million operation. They were going to drop hundreds of guys behind the lines. And during a break in this conference, Peter took the number 2 man on the CIA aside and said, we would save so much time and money if we just killed them ourselves. And he just said, I'm out. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. So he quit the agency right then.
All right, we're in Asia now, briefly, so it makes sense to turn to the 4th person in your book, Edward Lansdale. And you described Peter Sichel as a kind of biographer's dream. Lansdale, I guess, is a biographer's dream because, and I might be getting the chronology here wrong slightly, but there was a biography of Lansdale that came out, presumably while you were still working on this book. Max Boot's book, I think, came out a couple years ago, and he came on the podcast to talk about it. I'm just curious because that happens to every writer. You're working on a book, and then suddenly you sort of see out of the corner of your eye someone else covering similar territory. Were you aware of that project, and did you end up reading that?
Yeah, you're right. I think it's a built-in danger of everybody who does a straight biography, and invariably there's 2 other ones. Someone hasn't been written about for 100 years, and all of a sudden there's 3 biographies that come out. I was aware of Max's book, and I read it. I didn't feel at the time that it really conflicted with my book at all, because he's writing about one person, and he also carries Lansdale through his entire life. My book is very much about this period from the end of World War II to the mid-1950s, to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. So it was a very much this finite period. But Lansdale's another just a fascinating figure. He was a ad man in San Francisco, and he was sent out to the Philippines immediately after the end of World War II. And at the time, the Philippines, which was essentially an American colony, but ruled by a very corrupt oligarchy. There was the beginnings of a communist insurgency. And Lansdale really had this very simple idea that somehow was revolutionary for the time, which is that, if you want to win over the local population and steer them away from communism, you have to give them a government that they believe in, and you have to give them a stake in the system. And he proceeded to do that in the Philippines. He was a bit of a kingmaker. He first found this Filipino member of parliament, Raymond Magsaysay, who he engineered to become Minister of Defense and then later president. And almost single-handedly, certainly Filipinos would chafe against that idea, but with virtually no back support, Lansdale and Magsaysay revolutionized the Filipino military first, and then the Filipino political system. In 1954, Lansdale was back in Washington. He was viewed as something of a miracle worker within the American government. So the head of the CIA takes Lansdale aside and goes, you did such a great job in the Philippines. We want you to go to Vietnam and do the same thing there. So Lansdale goes off to Vietnam. He heads up the first American military mission to South Vietnam, and it's him and 12 other guys. And comes actually fairly close to maybe achieving the same thing in Vietnam that he achieved in the Philippines. But then it all, as we know, it all fell apart.
Didn't work out. There's a fifth significant figure at the heart of this book who's not one of your four CIA officers, and that's of course George Kennan. And I think most people, if they know George Kennan's name, they kind of associate him with the long telegram. For those who don't know him, tell us a little bit about Kennan and what role he plays in this period, this 1944 to 1956 that you cover in your book.
Kennan he had been a diplomat at the American embassy in Moscow, in the Soviet Union. From his time in the Soviet Union, he really became kind of an ardent anti-communist and was the first one, as you mentioned, the long telegram, really laying out in the immediate post-war period. Look, this is what the Soviets are up to. We are adversarial nations, and they have a whole game plan for taking over. And it really did slow off the mark with the Truman administration, but eventually had this very profound influence of gearing up the United States for the Cold War. It was also Kennan's idea. He was a senior at this point. He was a senior officer in the State Department, of creating the Office of Policy Coordination, of creating this covert operations wing of the American government that could operate undercover throughout the world, but that would still allow the American government, and especially its diplomats abroad, what he called, quote, plausible deniability. So it was it's the kind of left hand officially not knowing what the right hand's doing. And that was what the Office of Policy Coordination was supposed to do. He handpicked Frank Wisner to head the OPC. But I'm pretty harsh on Kennan in my book because while he was undoubtedly a brilliant man, I think at one point I call him a two-faced weasel.
That's pretty critical.
Right. Because he took plausible deniability to his own life. And for instance, he disavowed anything that Wisner was doing. And then a few years later would act shocked and appalled at some of the things that the OPC was doing around the world, and backpedaled ferociously to suggest that he really had no involvement in it. He didn't know what was going on. So he personified the whole policy of plausible deniability. But when it comes to an individual as opposed to an institution, I find it, I don't know, I find it pretty reprehensible that you would, you kind of sell out other people just to cover your own butt.
Well, speaking of selling out people, it seems to me also that one of the links between this book and Lawrence in Arabia, at least to this reader, feels like they're both very concerned with questions of empire, about its temptations and its dangers and its fallout during these two very different, these two different periods, the First World War and then the Second World War and post-war period. Is that how you see it? Is that a question that you've been interested in exploring?
I think what I'm fascinated by is, I mentioned earlier this idea of people finding themselves in this position of power, almost just through the force of their own personality, or it's an accident of fate that they happen to be at the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, as the case may be, and how they can affect change. And in some cases, very great change, like T.E. Lawrence, and just by the force of personality. But I think what also happens to these people, and what's also fascinating about them, is watching how they change or don't change as the circumstances around them change. This idea of going down a path and trying to figure out, is this a step too far? Where do I jump off? And I'll use the example of Peter Sichel. He reached his point when he was told that they were going to do this anti-communist partisan operation in mainland China. But prior to that, and here he was, a German Jew, he had worked with Nazis in post-war Berlin. It was unavoidable. He made peace with that. But as time went on, the CIA was dealing with kind of more and more reprehensible figures from the Nazi era. And so it's that exploration of when do people reach their breaking point, if they ever do at all.
Your title is obviously a reference to the Graham Greene novel. Why The Quiet Americans?
People have noticed that in my books, they seem to keep kind of taking from other from other books or movies. They were quiet because, of course, they had to be. That they were living double lives. They were spies. In some cases, even certainly if their wives knew what their role was with the agents, they didn't know any of the details of it. So, and it was this period when, of course, American influence in the American century is being challenged all around the world, and they're in the vanguard of that. But because of the nature of the Cold War, the nature of this particular conflict, um, they're the people on the front lines rather than soldiers. And because it's this whole underground subterranean war, there is a kind of silence about it. And as I mentioned before, talking with Peter Sichel, there are things that he did or saw 60 years ago, 70 years ago, that he still can't talk about, that he's still quiet about.
All right. Well, I won't give away anything here with the book, The Quiet Americans, other than to say it doesn't end well. The subtitle is, of course, that it is a tragedy in 3 acts. Scott, always a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Pamela, thanks so much. It was my pleasure.
Scott Anderson's new book is called The Quiet Americans, 4 CIA Spies at the Dawn of the Cold War, a tragedy in 3 acts. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Joining me now, my colleague Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent at The New York Times, and Susan Glasser, staff writer at The New Yorker. Both of them together, co-authors of the new book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. Peter, Susan, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
What I didn't say in the introduction is that you're also married. So you are in the same place physically as we speak, but you work for different news organizations. And before we get into James Baker, I have to talk about both of your lives a little bit. How does that work? Like, it's not like one of you is doing labor economics and the other is covering the theater. You're both covering Washington. Do you sort of, how do you compartmentalize that?
We're super lucky. Thank you, first of all, for having us on and for your interest in the book. It's really been a long labor of love to do this while also covering sort of the disruption of Washington. But, Peter and I started out working together at the Washington Post. And so I think we're just really lucky to be able to have a sort of seamless integration. I certainly see us as partners in this and whatever we do.
Sheeta was my editor, just to be clear, at the Washington Post when we met. So we established the order of succession from the very start.
This isn't the first book that you've written together. It's your second. How did it come about that you were going to do this biography of James Baker together? Because, Peter, you've written a few books in between.
Well, first of all, I have to say the good news is we're still talking to each other. So we did our first book, Kremlin Rising, after spending 4 years in Russia during the beginning of Vladimir Putin's tenure. And, actually, we finished that book on the very day that our son, Theo, was born. So, I guess we felt that both things worked out pretty well.
I'm always interested in that book baby timing thing because it usually doesn't work out quite that well. How do you divide in terms of, the work? Do you kind of each write a chapter and exchange chapters? Do you work collaboratively the whole way through? Is one of you sort of the primary editor? How does that, how does your working process go?
We actually did it differently this time than the first time. The first time we did individual chapters, right? About 20 chapters. Each of us did about 10, I think, and then we traded them and so forth. This time, it was a little bit more, we did a lot of the research together. We did a lot of the framing together. I did a lot of the first draft, and then Susan rewrote it and made it good. And I think that, and that worked out well. But I think each one is different depending on the kind of book you're doing, and this one happened to work that way. But yeah, it's a great thing for us to be able to do it together because our whole life now 20 years. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary last week, and our life together has been both personal and professional, and we have been partners in a lot of ways. So to be able to work on this together was a great joy.
Well, I think it's a great achievement to finish a book as co-authors, still speaking to one another, let alone still married to one another. So good work on that. Let's move to James Baker. Why a biography of James Baker, who, again, sort of to the outside eye, you might think, well, this is a man of the, I mean, he's still alive, obviously, 90 years old, but he's a person very much of the past, even though he was in, various offices not so long ago.
Yeah, he's a man of the past, but also I think his story is about today as well. And I think his story is so fascinating because he came from Houston, part of the Houston aristocracy, didn't want to do anything with politics, and then at midlife has a great tragedy in his own family and tries to recover from it by helping his friend from the tennis courts of the Houston Country Club, George Bush, run for office. And from there takes on some of the biggest, most demanding jobs of our time. But it's really also a story about Washington, how Washington has changed, right? The Washington of Jim Baker, from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, is a different place than we see today. And how he changed, how the Washington changed, and his struggles, by the way, to deal with the Trump era, all I think make this book relevant, not just as a matter of history, but as a matter of the present.
He was 40 when he first went to Washington. Is that correct?
That's right. And, we talk about that as maybe he was the most successful midlife career change ever, really. I think in doing the book, we realized something. We knew his glittering resume, his biography, but we didn't really understand just how close Baker came to never making it to Washington at all. And this late in life career switch was really a product of this friendship with George H.W. Bush, as Peter pointed out, but also of a family tragedy, the early death of his first wife. And also, I think a sense that he was really bored with the kind of corporate law and being a pillar of Houston society that not only Baker, but his father, his grandfather, and his great grandfather before him. He was really sort of a captive of family obligation and duty for the first 4 decades of his life in a way that I don't think we really understood till we started digging into the biography.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to talk a little bit about his early life because he was essentially born to be, as you say, a pillar of Houston society. Did he show any signs of being dissatisfied with that kind of life before he went to Washington? Like, talk a little bit about his upbringing.
Well, it is really remarkable. I mean, he was born basically alongside the Great Depression, did not feel its effects. He was so privileged that one story he recounted to us several times was that the sort of acute mortification and embarrassment he felt because his mother would send the family chauffeur every single day to school with hot lunch. And no matter how much he begged and pleaded just to be able to have a sandwich like the other kids, she insisted upon it. His family was very, very demanding, and that shaped him obviously in enormous ways. He told us that his nickname for his father was the Warden. So that gives you a sense of how demanding his father was. He would play tennis every day after school. He would practice it. And when he was done with his match, his father would make him go back to the court to keep practicing. I think that bred in him discipline, but also a certain fanatic competitiveness. And yet he never chafed at it. That's what's so interesting about this, is that he did what his father told him to do essentially for 40 years. His dad was so controlling that he actually insisted that as a law student, already married and with a child, that he pledge the same fraternity that his father had pledged. And he had freshmen in college inflicting hazing rituals on him, essentially because his father ordered it.
So this does not sound like the most obvious candidate for a person who's going to leave that life to go to start a completely different career at the age of 40. You mentioned the death of his first wife. What happened and how did that play a role in that decision?
Well, his first wife, Mary Stewart, they had 4 children together, 4 boys, and she came over with cancer basically in her late 30s. At first, they thought she was getting better, but then it turns out she wasn't. And we have this remarkable moment in the book where Baker is talking with his friend George Bush about politics. And in fact, Bush is going to move from the House to running for the Senate. He wants Baker to run for the House seat that he's going to give up. And Baker writes him this letter that's never been published before, explaining why he's not going to do that. And the reason why he's not going to do that is because his wife is going to die of cancer. And he knows it, and he hasn't told her. He hasn't told his mother. He hasn't told his wife. He hasn't told his kids. The one person he tells, the only person he confides this most horrible secret in his life, is George Bush. And I think that tells you a lot about the relationship that the two of them had and why it mattered so much through a lifetime of politics. You've never seen a president and secretary of state who were personal friends, who were forged in that kind of a, very, very deep personal bond before. And I think that moment was a pivot point in Baker's life.
His career transcended that friendship in that he was the chief of staff during two different presidential administrations. He ran two different campaigns. He was Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. How do you explain that? As his biographers, what do you think led to that kind of success? Because that sounds like it really goes beyond that one relationship with George H.W. Bush.
I think that's a great question because actually, right, a lot of presidents have brought their buddies to Washington with them. Remember, Mac McCarty was Bill Clinton's childhood friend, right? And Jim Baker is somebody who rose in Washington in a variety of different jobs, 5 different national presidential campaigns, 2 different cabinet positions, the gold standard White House chief of staff for Ronald Reagan, who ran against George H.W. Bush. So clearly his career was not purely a product of that close personal relationship. And that, by the way, was the question that every single person asked us when we said in Washington that we were working on this book. Democrats as well as Republicans see Baker, even today, long after sort of the height of his career trajectory here, as kind of the gold standard for how to actually get things done in Washington. And, he would tell you essentially that he's all about meticulous preparation. He has the 5 Ps. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. And he would beat this into the heads of his staff and his children. But of course, Washington is filled with workaholics and lawyers who stay up all night preparing for things, right? That's not really the secret.
I feel like that phrase is gonna haunt me now.
My son is quoted back to us frequently on the subject of homework. It's harder to live by than you think, by the way. Baker was meticulously prepared in our experience, but that obviously doesn't explain it. I think it's his fanatic competitiveness combined with an innate negotiating and deal making skill that does something that is become all too rare, perhaps even disappeared entirely in today's Washington, which is the ability to understand what the other person in the negotiation needs and to get there. He's essentially an innate deal maker. And even late in life, into his 80s, that's the thing that he would take the most pride in. He was making deals well into his 80s. For example, the head of the Texas Episcopal Church came to him and said, "We have a problem. All the Southern churches don't want to accept gay ministers." And they were all breaking away from the National Episcopal Church. Jim Baker, who, by the way, isn't even an Episcopalian at this point, managed to negotiate essentially a deal in which the Texas Episcopalians would get a longer time period to put the new policies into effect, but they were the only Southern church that didn't break away. That's just who he is. He's a deal maker by nature, experience, and inclination.
It seems like it would be accurate then to describe him as more of a pragmatist than an ideologue. But what were his politics? Like, how political was he? What were his beliefs beyond getting things done?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, he was always suspect to the Reaganites. The Reaganites thought he wasn't a true blood conservative because he considered himself a pragmatist. But I think he is a conservative. He's a small c conservative. He's not a revolutionary in the way that we think of today's conservatives, right? He wanted to be, he was cautious. He was careful. He didn't believe in changing the world. But when the world was changing, he tried to figure out how to manage it so that it would, the plane would land safely, whether it be the Reagan Revolution in the 80s, whether it be the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the end of the Cold War, the Iraq War. All these big moments weren't things that he started, but what he tried to do is manage them. So his politics were sort of the politics of of stability to the extent that he could impose that on a disorderly world. So he is a conservative, small c. He would take the conservative position on most issues, but he also didn't let that stand in the way, right? He sat down with the Democrats to work out a deal on Social Security. He sat down with the Democrats to work out a deal on tax reform. He sat down with the Democrats to end the Contra War. He was not going to let that stop him from getting stuff done. At the same time, he was a fierce partisan, a real knife fighter. When it came to election time, he was willing to do whatever it took to get elected. As Susan said, fiercely competitive. Ask Michael Dukakis, ask Al Gore, they'll tell you.
This was, after all, the man who was responsible for Willie Horton.
Exactly. Willie Horton happens on his watch.
What does he say about that now?
Well, what he says about that, he doesn't have any regrets. We asked him. He says, no, I think we did what we had to do. He would strive to point out that the Bush campaign itself didn't put up the most notorious ad that we remember featuring Willie Horton. But they did talk about the furlough program, and they did use Willie Horton's name. And I think he just thinks that, it was the way you had to do to win an office. And it was sort of in some ways a precursor to a lot of the politics that has followed.
Susan, earlier you described him as intensely competitive. Does that mean that he was also ambitious? And if so, did he succeed in his own ambitions? Presumably he never wanted to be president, or did he?
Well, he entertained the notion of being president, I think, himself. It was natural, a man of his ability. He was at Reagan's right hand, for the first 4 years of that presidency. He kept a file for many years of people who sent him letters suggesting that he should run for president. And, he and George Bush used to sort of josh each other. And when it got a little too sharp, George Bush would say to him, well, if you're so bright, how come, if you know so well, how come you're not vice president? And then, of course, when Bush became president, he also elevated that bar. But he said, well, if you're so great, Jimmy, how come you're not the president? After Bush was defeated in 1992, there was a period of time when Baker seriously considered running for president. But the truth is, the Republican Party had left him, and there was no room for a pragmatic, if sharp-elbowed, centrist Republican at the time. And that tells you a lot about the change in the Republican Party. But also, he was not a man of retail politics, as he would admit. In fact, the book looks at his one and only effort to become an elected official, the 1978 Texas Attorney General's race, which he not only lost, but I think revealed even to his closest friends that he was not made for kissing babies and shaking hands.
Well, you guys both interviewed him extensively for this book. What did you make of him? I mean, did you find that he was introspective? You talked about how he has no regrets. Was he thoughtful? Had he spent time sort of going over his career, and was he open in sharing? Did he kind of keep a sort of impenetrable exterior in terms of talking about himself and his own motivations and feelings?
I'm laughing because the answer to your questions is yes to all of the above. He was extremely helpful and forthcoming, and yet extremely impenetrable. And look, he is definitely a man of his era and class. And, he's not the sort who kept a diary. He didn't keep his own historian on staff. He wasn't self-consciously living for history in the way that some of these quote unquote great men were. He's not a guy who is going to give you great insight into his internal monologue to the extent it exists. In fact, we learned that Jim Baker, in addition to being fanatically competitive and loving to play tennis, what he really is an outdoorsman, a man of nature. He's well known as a hunter. What he really loves is to be alone in nature. More than shooting the birds, he seems to like to look at them. That's a kind of an introspective but lonely perspective. He worked very closely with a team of people for a long time, but he wasn't personally intimate with them. He was on very formal terms with them. One of his closest advisors told us he'd never been invited over to their house for dinner.
He's not going to be the one who's going to reveal his soul to you, but you go to, who do you go to? You go to his wife, right? You go to his kids. We interviewed all 8 of his kids. We interviewed his nanny, who is still alive, over 100 years old. We talked to his cousin before his cousin passed away. We talked to everybody we could. I thought his wife, Susan, who is a lovely person, was as insightful about him as anybody, right, Sue? I think we were talking at one point, for instance, about painful moments for Baker, and he's not really one to offer that. She told us that this episode early on in his career, when he got it's a scandal that nobody remembers today about the Carter briefing book ending up in the Reagan campaign, and Baker got into a fight over who had it, right? Whether it was him or Bill Casey. And Susan Baker told us this was the most painful thing that he had experienced in their life together in his second marriage, with the exception of the death of a granddaughter, that those were the two most painful things that he experienced. And I thought that told us a lot about Baker, about how much he cared about his reputation, his integrity, the perception and understanding that he was an honorable person, and that somebody would question that was to him almost equivalent to a death in the family.
What about his enemies? What do his enemies say?
Well, his enemies there, and there are quite a few of them, say he's manipulative, that he cared more about his own reputation than about the larger cause. The Reaganites never accepted him. He outmaneuvered his enemies time and time again. That didn't make him popular among some of them in particular. The conservatives would say he was the one who was sort of making Reagan compromise on his principles. Well, the answer that Baker would give is that Reagan he did nothing that Reagan didn't want him to do, that Reagan, in fact, wanted a pragmatist there as his chief of staff, and that the critics are, either jealous or felt that they had, were ideological. Even to this day, you get him talking about what he would consider the right-wing kooks, I think is a phrase he's used. And he just doesn't understand ideology for the sake of ideology. It doesn't compute to him, which is one of the reasons I think this era has been so hard for him.
What would you say his lasting impact, his sort of legacy is? And I'm curious what he thinks his legacy is.
Throughout his career, and you even see this today, Baker was just chafing to be seen as a principal in his own right, as a statesman, as a leader, not a mere handler. He hated it, in fact, when Time magazine put him on the cover as a handler. He wanted to be the Secretary of State who helped to bring the Cold War into essentially a relatively peaceful landing. And in many ways, that is his legacy. I just think if you go back and you look at the events of 1989 through 1991 alone, this was a world in tumult. And he and Bush and their stewardship of how they dealt with the Soviets, in hindsight, it seems much more clear than it did at the time. And for me, researching this, having spent years traveling in the former Soviet Union and thinking about this very set of issues, what I came away realizing about Baker was, especially when you look at this 9-month window in which they had to negotiate German reunification, that was not inevitable. And it was a really tough piece of diplomacy. It wasn't just the Soviets, it was the British and the French as well, who were deeply, deeply skeptical of putting Germany, its World War II enemy, back together again. And this is something that, even if he did nothing else, would be a lasting accomplishment for Jim Baker.
All right, I have a final question, which is, you begin the book with Baker's response to Trump in the election of 2016, the fact that he did not become a never-Trumper. And given that so many of his generation, the sort of establishment Republicans who no longer had a dog in the race or no longer actively in Washington in any way, did take a stand against Donald Trump, the sort of most radical anti-establishment figure, why not James Baker? And what is he planning with this current election? Do you know?
It really goes to the heart of the current modern Republican Party, right? If Jim Baker, who ran 5 presidential campaigns, who 4 Republican presidents depended on, who is the anti-Trump in so many ways, right? Whether it be in terms of personal demeanor and temperament, whether it be in the view of public service and politics, if he can't break with Trump, then I think that helps explain why the Republican Party has accepted Trump, even though they don't like him, right? We talked with Baker about this. We started the book before Trump actually came to the scene because, as Susan said, we were interested in Washington and the dysfunction and how things had changed from his time. And when Trump came along, we had 5 years basically of conversations with Baker in which he wrestled out loud, really tortured about what to do. And he ultimately, his compromise was not going to endorse, not to publicly support, but he would vote for him. In private, he told us he thought that Trump was crazy. That was his word, crazy. Nuts is another word he used. I mean, he just couldn't understand why Trump would do the things he did. And yet he wouldn't or couldn't break away. And I think it's because for Baker, power is about being inside the room. And once you're outside the room throwing rocks, you don't have it. And it's not that he needs it anymore, but it's just his nature is to be in the room if he can be. And to be a never Trumper would put him outside the room.
One point on that, his own closest political friends and partners, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, did not vote for Donald Trump. He had every easy excuse not to do it. And I will never forget sitting with Jim Baker in his suite at the Willard Hotel. It was just Halloween 2016, just a few days before the election. And this man was in agony. Everyone in his life that he cared about was going to vote against Donald Trump. And he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And I began and ended the interview with it. And I said, is Jim Baker really going to vote for a man like Donald Trump? In so many ways, he is the un-Trump. And finally, at the very end, he was just sort of squirming about this. And he just said, well, I haven't voted for him yet. But then he did.
And 2020?
We had lunch with him one time last year, and he was just so fed up with Trump. He says, if Biden wins the nomination, I could probably vote for him. But then a couple months later, we went and saw him in Houston. And he says, don't say I'm going to vote for Biden. He already changed his mind. He couldn't quite pull himself away. And his argument is, look, I'm a Republican. I don't like Trump. I don't agree with everything he's doing, but I like the judges. I like the deregulation. I like the taxes. And we don't know where he's going to end up at this point. At this point, he has decided he's no longer going to talk about this subject. And I think he's pretty sick of us asking about it.
Well, Peter, I like your James Baker imitation. Very well done. Peter, Susan, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much.
Peter Baker and Susan Glasser are the authors together of The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
How are things going?
So things continue to be not just steady, but actually quite strong, particularly when you're looking at print book sales. So the latest figures from NPD BookScan showed that print unit sales rose more than 7% in early September. And that comes after a pretty big jump in August when they were up 13% over July, which was also up over June by 16%. So the question now, as NPD put it, is will this superheated market continue, making this one of the strongest years ever for print book sales? At the same time, because of the pandemic and shutdown, the way that these sales are occurring has really shifted the marketplace in ways that are kind of alarming to a lot of people who are looking at the long-term health of the publishing and book-selling ecosystem. So you saw bookstore sales fall by more than 24% in July, and that comes after pretty steep drops in earlier months. So, this is showing that, like every industry, sales have really rapidly shifted to online. And the question is, can you ever unwind that? After the pandemic, a lot of these, unfortunately, it's possible that a lot of bookstores could close and that the market could change permanently. At the same time, I think the uneven gains are a concern in terms of which books are selling and which authors are selling and which publishers are benefiting. So you seem to see, again, the biggest gains going to the biggest houses. Penguin Random House has done extraordinarily well for many reasons. They have, an incredible roster of authors. They had a lot of the anti-racism books that people wanted to read. They also have this very sophisticated print and distribution infrastructure, 4 distribution centers across the country. They ship 7 days a week. So when there was pressure on the supply chain because of the pandemic and shutdown, they were able to keep books moving. Smaller publishers actually, have struggled to do that and have had to, push back publication dates. Some of them had issues at their warehouses. And then when you look at it on the author level, again, just because everyone's pretty much buying their stuff online, the books that you tend to see are the books that are selling. That's just sort of the way the online economy works. So you see the bestsellers selling more and more, and new books or the debut authors, the mid-list authors are sort of struggling for attention. So it's good news. On the one hand, people are reading a lot. There's a lot of great new books coming out that people can read, including, later this year, right after the election, Barack Obama's book is coming out with a massive first printing. There's been a ton of extremely popular best-selling books about the Trump administration, but there is a question of sort of what this means long-term for kind of the literary ecosystem.
Pre-pandemic, independent bookstores had been experiencing a real comeback. I mean, has this completely washed out all of those gains?
That is a great question. I know it has definitely been a massive setback in terms of, how lasting that will be. That's still a question. The American Booksellers Association tracks sales, and they paused doing that for a while because they said, we really can't compare this year to last year. It's a completely different reality now. But I think that is a real concern because there had been a very encouraging resurgence. It sort of flipped. Barnes and Noble became the underdog. They had been struggling for a long time, and people who like to shop in bookstores had really shifted to their local independents in many cases. And you saw new stores opening and sales up. So I think that is a big question going forward is will those stores recover? Will they stay in business? And, they've done incredibly well, I think, adjusting very quickly overnight to online sales. There have been developments like bookshop.org, which is sort of the alternative to Amazon if you want to support independence. That was extremely helpful to a lot of bookstores, but is that enough to kind of keep them in business? And we don't know exactly.
Oh, this is very upsetting,
I'm
Alexandra.
sorry. Let me see if I can think of any good news to add. Well, here's some, I think, particularly exciting news that's going to be coming soon as we enter literary award season. We're going to be getting the Booker winner, the Nobel winner, the National Book Awards. And that's always a huge driver for sales for often authors who maybe were overlooked commercially, but have written some of what judges determine or the best and most important books of the year. So I think when we start getting some of those prizes, that'll drive a lot of attention to books that perhaps were overlooked earlier.
And they're all going to be on top of each other. So it'll be really interesting to see how that kind of all plays out. So lots of award winners to look forward to. And independent bookstores are still out there. They're still doing business. I hope people do continue to patronize them, whether online or curbside pickup or delivery or on occasion in-store shopping. I don't know about you. Have you been to any bookstores lately, Alexandra?
I have been buying from them, but not necessarily visiting them. I did pop into McNally Jackson in Williamsburg. They have, curbside setup and everything like that. But I agree. Yeah, these stores are in business. They're open, and they have a variety of ways for people to shop in a way that they're comfortable. So how about you? Have you been to any bookstores lately?
I discovered this great little independent bookstore in Cold Spring, New York, over a recent end of summer weekend called Split Rock Books. And they were open by appointment for in-store browsing. And it was very heartening to see that outside their door, there were lots of packages there for curbside pickup. So clearly people are interested in still patronizing their local bookstore.
For sure.
All right. We'll leave it on that note. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and Jumana Khatib. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hey, Pamela.
Greg, let's start with you. What are you reading?
I'm reading Natasha Trethewey's new memoir called Memorial Drive. Trethewey, our listeners may know, is an impressively accomplished poet. She's won the Pulitzer Prize for, I think, her second or third collection. She's twice served as the U.S. Poet Laureate. And in her work, she often looks at American history, especially as it intersects with race, and sometimes with her own personal history as well. She grew up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast as the daughter of a white father and a black mother at a time when miscegenation was still illegal in Mississippi. She remembers the Klan burning a cross in her parents' driveway when she was young. So that was a very formative thing for her. And she's written a lot about kind of race in American history in her work. But there's this secret part of her story, or a part that she never really went into in her poetry until her most recent collection, Monument, a few years ago, where she finally addressed this. Her mother was murdered when she was 40 years old, when Natasha Trethewey was 19 years old, by Natasha's stepfather, by her mother's second ex-husband, whom she was in the process of leaving, and he had been abusive and possessive and clinging to her. He kept kind of stalking her after she left him until it finally escalated to the point that he shot her dead. And she finally started writing some poems about that, I guess, in the process of writing this memoir. And some of those poems made their way into her last book, which was my first glimpse of this part of her life as somebody who's read Natasha Trethewey's poetry for a while. And it's just heartbreaking. And so now this memoir comes along. It's called Memorial Drive. It's really a tribute to her mother. Because she's a poet, she's got this talent for compression. Even just the title, Memorial Drive, it's named after the main east-west thoroughfare in Atlanta, where Natasha and her mother moved after her parents' divorce. So she grew up from the age of 6 in Atlanta and New Orleans, where her father had relocated. And so you of course, get the sense of memoir and memory from Memorial Drive. And it's named Memorial Drive after the huge Confederate War memorial at the end of it. It's called Stone Mountain, and it's got Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and somebody else. I'm not remembering now who the third person is. So it brings together kind of all of her obsessions, the Civil War, America's history of race, and she uses that as this symbol of what we choose to remember as a nation. Certainly in the South, the whole Confederate monument thing, but Memorial Drive is also where her mom's apartment was and where she was killed. And so this is this emotionally very tough book, looking back, some at her childhood with her parents in Mississippi, but then especially it's a real tribute to her mother. Jumana, how about you?
I've been looking forward to reading Natasha Trethewey's book, and I'm glad you reminded me. I'm having trouble juggling all this stuff I want to get to, but I picked up recently Convenience Store Woman by C.I.A. Murata, which is her English language debut, but she's pretty established in Japan, and I think this was a breakout hit there, and here too. And I've been wanting to read this book for years and finally got around to it. So it basically centers on this woman who works in one of Japan's convenience stores, this 24-hour, almost like Jeff Koons, like backlit neon stores. And this woman's a bit of an outlier. She's been working there for 18 years and she really keeps to herself. And I think she kind of feels quite a bit different than a lot of people. But the book is filled with these amazing observations about people. In the first scene, she talks about how she's able to gauge whether a customer is even going to pay with change or pay with a credit card. And so even though this woman is quite different and quite unusual, she's working really, really hard to conform to norms. And anyway, this is resonating with me these days because it made me realize how nostalgic I was for those little cues of, sussing out a stranger and all that. So I think it's really resonating with me doubly so now.
And she has a new book coming out here this fall in translation.
Yeah. And I'm hoping to read that one too, or at least I'm glad I'm going to read this before the new one comes out.
So I have a very half-formed, actually not even half-formed, an ill-informed opinion or idea that there has been a growing number of books by Japanese women about the workplace, whether it's a factory or a convenience store or an office. And I feel like I've only got like 2 or 3 examples in my back pocket. One of them is this book. And then I have grand theories as to why they're writing this way. But of course, it all rests on this very faulty premise of maybe it's only 3 books,
That's all you need. I think 3 is a trend.
That's right. 2 is a trickle, 3 is a trend. But I also feel that there should be more books about the cashier experience, which I too, I've been a cashier in a number of places. I miss it. I think there's a lot that you see from, being at that point of purchase spot that you can observe from people. So I love that it includes the idea that she is, trying to determine whether someone is a cash or credit type.
There's something in the way that Jumana describes the book, or maybe also in what I've read about this book, that makes it sound like a throwback to that kind of great Gen X literature, including the book Gen X itself, or like the movie Slackers. I don't know that she smokes pot, but it feels, if she's been at this convenience store for 18 years working there, she's kind of stuck and yet very observant.
Oh, she could totally be a David Lynch creation, like she could absolutely, or even a John Waters creation. I can absolutely see this woman existing in one of their universes.
I feel like you guys are describing different movie versions of this book.
I know. We'll have to go to the mat, Greg.
Right. You're in like the Linklater, version, Greg, and you're over with David Lynch.
I'm going to go with Jumana, though, because she's actually reading the book.
Fair enough.
Pamela, how about you? What are you reading?
I recently finished reading Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. And Wilkerson, of course, was a guest on the podcast talking about this book, as she was last year. Was it now that it was the year before, talking about Michelle Obama's book, but also about her own first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which is probably one of my favorite narrative nonfiction books of all time.
That's the history of the Great Migration.
Yes. And so I had very high hopes for this book, and there's a lot that I like in it. I think I still would say that I preferred The Warmth of Other Suns to this book, and I look forward to Wilkerson's next book, which I like to imagine as like The Warmth of Other Suns Part 2, although she probably has very, different things in mind, because I think what Wilkerson does so well, if I had to kind of distill it into three things, I would say she's an incredible journalist. She is meticulous in terms of her interviews, following stories, just being incredibly thorough. The way in which she told these extended family stories in The Warmth of Other Suns, you can see bits of it in Caste, which is more of an argument book, but it was that aspect that I loved the most in this book. She's also just an incredible storyteller and writer. If you want to know how to take a subject, whether it's race in America, or in this case, this idea of caste transcending three very different time, places, and cultures, that is Jim Crow America up through today in terms of the Black experience in this country, the caste experience in India, the abolishment of the caste system and diaspora, and then Nazi Germany and the treatment of Jews under the Nazi regime. So it's an argument book. It's kind of taking these three and sort of linking them together and coming up with a sort of unified theory as to why caste is the better way to think about these very intransient, persistent divisions that exist within a society. But I really loved that the storytelling. And the third thing that she does so well, and she did it in The Warmth of Other Suns, and she does it here, is that she is really able to convey emotion and to rouse emotion in the reader. And it's funny, I just was listening to a conversation that our critic Pearl Sagal led yesterday with three fiction writers, Marlon James and Rachel Kushner and Ayat Akhtar. And it was a great conversation. But at one point, Marlon James said, empathy is overrated. And Marlon James said all these wonderful things, and I'm inclined to agree with him just because he was so, I don't know, charismatic and persuasive in the way he delivered them. And yet that's what she does here. What Marlon James said, if I understood correctly, was that empathy or eliciting empathy in the reader it's not on the writer to do that. It's on the reader to bring it to the book. And so that I thought was interesting, but certainly whatever that alchemy is in terms of generating empathy, that's what Wilkerson has. And so there's really no way that a human being can read her work and not, tear up on numerous occasions. So that is in here as well. So it's a really thought-provoking book. I think that there's something to be admired in her effort to explain something that feels like our current language around race hasn't adequately explained, hasn't, and she's sort of looking for a way to illuminate some kind of deeper truth here. And so in that sense, I really admired and enjoyed is the wrong word here, because it's a very dark subject, but I got a lot out of this book.
You mentioned that she brings in other cultures and their caste systems. Is that an attempt to kind of break through the limits of American conception about race, to show that we've kind of drawn borders around it in a very cultural sense, but that in fact other cultures have other ways of thinking about it? Or
I actually led a conversation, an informal, of course, virtual Zoom-based, conversation with some colleagues at the book review and on our desk, and also from around the Times about this book earlier this week, because I felt like there was so much in here to discuss. And one of the questions that came up that several people raised was this question of audience. Who is this book for? And some of the Black women in particular in this gathering sort of felt like, well, on the one hand, a lot of this feels very much a reflection of and an affirmation of their own experience living in America. On the other hand, it's not news to them. And so other people thought, maybe this is that book that you give to someone who doesn't quite get the extent or the depth to which racism operates in this country. This is how you get someone perhaps to open their eyes by seeing that, look, even if you don't personally identify with this, no one likes the Nazis, but also just to kind of see, like, look, this does not operate in isolation. There's something fundamentally human in the need to create and perpetuate lines that separate the us from the them and put the them someplace below the us.
It's so interesting. And another book that I'm reading right now is Claudia Rankine's new book, Just Us. And it's very much about kind of the racial imagination, the way that we fantasize about race, but then how that plays out in real ways.
So you're reading two non-poetry books by poets because you're the poetry editor.
The Claudia Rankine is a poetry book in the same way that Citizen is poetry and essay and art. It kind of brings everything together because that is her mode as a poet. It's more that she has all these thoughts and lets them kind of interact on the page.
Let's run down the books that we read again. Jumana?
So I'm reading Convenience Store Woman by C.I.A. Murata.
I'm reading Natasha Trethewey's Memorial Drive.
And I read Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.